Welcome to this April edition of the Australian-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm a volunteer with the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. Our principal solicitor, Anna Kerr, is doing tech with Kate Williamson, so thanks to those women. I live and work on Darug and Gundungurra Nurra outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations across this continent. And now to introduce our excellent panel. Nerissa Scott lives on Gubbi Gubbi country, Sunshine Coast of Queensland. She is a former radio broadcaster and journalist who has worked in commercial radio in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Nerissa is a spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australasia. She's concerned about the erosion of women's sex-based rights and the silencing of women who dare to speak out about this. She speaks on behalf of her young daughter and women everywhere. Sand Hall lives on Dharawal country, south coast of New South Wales. She began a career in radical feminist activism in the mid-70s as part of New Zealand's Backstreet Women's Theatre Group, educating and agitating in relation to proposed anti-abortion laws. Migrating to Australia in 1988, after being captivated by the land and utopian vision of Amazon acres and the women's lands of northern New South Wales, she has focused on developing lesbian community and human rights. Sand was a co-convener of the Lesbian Space Project, which went on to purchase a building in Newtown, Sydney, for a lesbian cultural and community centre, which was sold, sadly, not long after. No longer legally allowed to organise events for women born female due to the imposition of a trans and queer agenda, Sand became part of the underground lesbian scene. Still involved with the women's lands, Sand is starting to put out the call for contributions to a third collection of women's stories of the lands. The last in a trilogy, the book will help mark 50 years since Amazon Acres began. Karyn Lisignoli lives on Noongar country, Perth, Western Australia. She is a spokesperson for the Respect My Sex If You Want My Vote campaign in Australia. Karyn has had a 20+ year career as a charitable secure executive and leadership mentor. However, she was cancelled just 10 days into her job as CEO for Girl Guides WA for questioning their definition of women and girls as anyone who identifies as a girl or a woman rather than biological females. So if I could invite you to kick off. Nerissa Scott.
So I was meant to give a similar talk in Brisbane in March as part of International Women's Day, organised by the powerhouse that is Anna McCormack. But Queensland floods meant I didn't present that weekend, so I volunteered to talk tonight. As Janet said, I'm Nerissa, and I'm a spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australasia. You may have heard of us. We're a non-partisan grassroots group, which is part of an international coalition of women's organisations, athletes and supporters of women in sport who assert that male athletes should not compete in female sport. We are all volunteers and we get no funding, contrary to what some of our detractors would have you believe. We think that while everyone has the right to play sport, no one has the right to play in any category they choose. Unfortunately, in the past year, we've seen a rise in mediocre male entitlement encroaching on women's sport. Science denialism coupled with trans activism is having a devastating impact. Like many of the women speaking out on these issues, I assume, I would rather not be. I would rather I didn't have to. I would much rather be putting my energy and time into other pursuits, playing with my baby daughter, relaxing at the beach, or honestly stabbing a blunt object in my eye. That's not only for the anxiety many of us feel public speaking, one of the #1 fears held among the population, and in my case, that's despite a background in radio journalism and broadcasting. But it's also the anxiety of the potential unwanted attention we might attract from activists who disagree with the facts we speak about. Attention that we know can turn to harassment, doxing, being cancelled, threats, and even physical violence. And heartbreakingly, we've had to witness this in real time very recently in relation to the courageous Catherine Deves, co-founder of Save Women's Sport Australasia. For standing up for women's sex-based rights, Catherine has received death threats and fears for her safety and the safety of her family. Her young daughters and partner have moved out of their family home in Sydney due to these very real risks, and the AFP is investigating. And that's not to mention the grotesque witch hunt playing out with the likes of several so-called journalists, with the majority of the mainstream media totally captured and basically working as a propaganda machine. The taxpayer-funded ABC is now akin to the Ministry of Truth. Article 4 of the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights is about reaffirming women's rights to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression. It says states should ensure that women have the right to hold opinions without interference. This should include the right to hold and express opinions about gender identity without being subject to harassment, prosecution, or punishment. It's been a very stressful and confronting time for many of us watching how Catherine Deves is being treated. The misogyny we're witnessing and being subjected to today is off the charts. The other reason I prefer not to speak tonight is simply because it seems so wildly insane that we have to speak at all, when all we're doing is acknowledging and asserting reality and biology, our lived experience. However, here we are. Courage calls to courage everywhere. I'm just a mum, a wife, a woman, and I refuse to stay silent when not only my rights are being destroyed, but also the rights of my daughter. And of course, when I say woman, you know that I mean an adult human female, not an identity, not a label, not a costume, not an idea in a man's head. This erosion and dismantling of rights due to the ideological capture of institutions, academia, and governments has been happening under stealth. And we're seeing it in legislation, not just here in Australia, but across the West, with gender identity, which is at direct odds with women's sex-based rights, being enshrined in law. When it comes to sport, we know it is utterly meaningless without fair competition, which is why we have separate categories for disabled people, for children, and for women. However, a desire to be inclusive is having serious negative consequences for women and girls who are losing fair and meaningful competition at all levels of female sport. I know I'm preaching to the converted, but just in case, why the need for the female-only sport category? There are well-known structural differences between males and females. Males typically have proportionately more muscle mass, more bone mass, and a lower percentage of body fat than women. What is less commonly recognised is that there are structural differences between adult males and females for many, if not all, organ systems that can have significant impact on physiological function. For example, sex differences in lung size have important consequences. Men have larger lungs, wider airways, and greater lung diffusion capacity than women. An important consequence of this structural difference is that in contrast to healthy young men, maximal exercise capacity may be limited by pulmonary or lung capacity in women, especially as they age. Researchers also recently discovered 6,500 genes that differ between the sexes. These genetic differences lead to very visible physical differences. The male skeleton is 9% larger, the male skull is larger. There are thousands of observable differences in the male and female body. And seeing as male competitive advantage cannot be completely mitigated by testosterone suppression, a level playing field can never be achieved. Not to mention multiple other reasons aside from safety and fairness. For example, some women's religious beliefs forbid them from being in a state of undress around males or seeing males in a state of undress. Many women wouldn't be comfortable in this same scenario anyway. Privacy, dignity, the unwanted male gaze. And there's studies which show the many benefits of sport participation for females in relation to confidence and self-esteem, all of which would be lost if females self-exclude due to the presence of men in their sports. Yet, we're told that it's unproblematic and, importantly, kind to allow men who adopt a feminine identity into the female category, when in fact all men can and should compete in the men's category, and the women's category should remain restricted to females only, as it was designed. Change the men's category to an open category and the problem is solved. Or as Dawn Fraser perhaps innocently pointed out last week, I don't think it's fair to have transgender men competing against women. Why don't transgender people compete against each other? That would solve all the problems. Article 7 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is about reaffirming women's rights to the same opportunities as men to participate actively in sports and physical education. This is already protected under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, an international treaty to which both Australia and New Zealand are signatories. This should include the provision of opportunities for girls and women to participate in sports and physical education on a single-sex basis. To ensure fairness and safety for women and girls, the entry of boys and men who claim to have female gender identities into teams, competitions, facilities, or changing rooms inter alia set aside for women and girls should be prohibited as a form of sex discrimination. At the Tokyo Games last year, we had to watch and collectively cringe as New Zealand's 43-year-old Laurel, aka Gavin Hubbard, appeared in women's weightlifting. What an absolute farce and an insult to women the world over. Here we had a middle-aged, mediocre, balding, wealthy, well-connected man. His father is a former Auckland mayor and billionaire businessman on the world stage, being called she and her. Journalists at the Games were given a thick handbook on how to report on this correctly and what language to use so as not to offend. But what about the offence caused to women and girls? What about the young girls watching at home? Watching what was clearly a man taking the place of a female athlete and it being applauded as stunning and brave. Various media outlets reported it as Hubbard making history, the first openly transgender athlete to compete in a different gender category to their sex assigned at birth, and similar gender woo-woo crap. Richard Budgett, the medical and scientific director for the International Olympic Committee, even said, Laurel Hubbard is a woman and is competing under the rules of her federation. We have to pay tribute to her courage and tenacity in qualifying for the Games. The fact Hubbard wasn't even competitive on the day, or that he perhaps threw the competition as some suspect, is irrelevant. He is a has-been, past his athletic prime and returning from an injury. What is relevant is a female athlete was denied her opportunity to participate and compete at this level because unfair, outrageous rules give males admission to the women's category. To add insult to injury, in January, the IOC released updated guidance which state there is no need for trans women to lower their testosterone at all to compete in the women's category. You couldn't make this stuff up. This new framework totally ignores the science on sex, gender, and performance and instead focuses on inclusion. It's come under fire from medical experts from multiple sports federations, including World Athletics, World Triathlon, and the International Cycling Union, who say it opens the door to unfair competition in female sport. Then this year, we've had to endure Leah, aka Will Thomas, smashing and setting new women's college swimming records in the States. The 22-year-old competed on the men's team as recently as November 2019. Not to mention reports his female teammates are uncomfortable being made to share facilities with a man, a fully intact male, who enjoys walking around semi-nude in the female change rooms. This is assault. This is indecent exposure. This is the insanity of the gender wars. Just like the scandal at the Korean women's spa in LA, when a registered sex offender exposed his genitals to women and children. That transgender male was later charged with indecent exposure. But we are told to suck it up, just be kind, don't be transphobic. The positive is this: these issues are no longer in the dark. A spotlight has been shone on them here in Australia especially. Immense thanks must go to Save Women's Sport Australasia's co-founder, Catherine Deves. Catherine has peaked millions. Kath has stepped away from this campaign to focus on her candidacy in the upcoming federal election, but due to her standing and the media scrutiny she's been subjected to in the process, this collision of rights and many of the associated wrongs being done to women as a sex class are front and centre, despite ongoing attempts to silence and cancel women like Catherine. Catherine is confident she can win her seat in Warringah. She's not giving up. Whatever your political persuasion, you would have to agree that to have a radfem voice in Canberra, the calibre of Catherine, would be a very positive step for Australian women and girls and others negatively impacted by gender identity theory. Kath appreciates the support she's receiving from all sides in standing up for our rights and the rights of her daughters and ours, and we will be forever grateful for her courage. Though it has come at immense personal cost, she is a hero and a warrior and should inspire us all to be brave. Our silence will not save us. A bit of background, one of the reasons we're in this mess is because of new guidelines for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse people in sport, introduced by the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2019. These policies, developed by Australia's leading sport governing body, Sport Australia, working with a lobby group that receives millions of dollars in government funding, Pride in Sport, prioritise the feelings of an apparently small minority at the expense of 50% of the population. Yet on the Sport Australia website, it has the audacity to say, "We recognise that people cannot enjoy themselves or perform at their best if they are treated unfairly." Then in October 2020, Senator Claire Chandler, introduced Catherine to Rowena Edge of Save Women's Sports New Zealand. Kath had raised concerns with Senator Chandler about the new guidelines that displace sex as the category for sport competition in favour of self-declared gender identity. Seeing as Australia and New Zealand were both facing the same issues, Save Women's Sport Australasia was formed and joined a movement to protect the integrity of women's sport. We are part of the resistance, a growing global resistance to this insidious ideology, which positions the special feelings of men and boys above the lived reality of girls and women. Unsurprising to many, Catherine Deves helped Senator Claire Chandler in drafting the Save Women's Sport Bill, which Senator Chandler introduced into Parliament recently. This bill seeks to ensure that women's single-sex sport is protected and encouraged, and that a male is not entitled to demand that they be included on the basis of gender identity. Save Women's Sport has received hundreds of emails from sportswomen, girls and their parents, coaches, and others who can see the issues created by prioritising this intangible gender identity over biological sex, the unfairness due to male athletic advantage, and the fear of speaking out and being labelled a bigot or transphobe. I know I don't only speak for myself when I say we don't care if they call us transphobic. It has no meaning. When it comes to sport, this is simply about fairness. Activists play the transphobia card to silence and intimidate, to deter us from speaking out. We're told trans women are women and are expected to accept that fallacy, no debate. But we know for a fact that trans women are men. We recognise this reality and refuse to have our language altered to accommodate this ideological takeover. We refuse to pretend men are women, to pretend that men don't have physiological and biological advantages due to being male. We refuse to subscribe to this lie that effectively erases women as a sex class. Mediocre males invading women's spaces and sports, disregarding women's boundaries, forcing their way in and demanding girls and women go along with the absolute bollocks that these entitled males are in fact women. A female's experience of her biological sex is in no way the same as a man who identifies as a woman, whatever that means. Something we can all do is contact our federal MPs and senators, write letters, meet with them, raise your concerns, educate them. Head to savewomensport.com, join the mailing list, donate to the cause if you can, and join the resistance. We 100% support the Respect My Sex If You Want My Vote campaign and applaud the women who've made that happen here in Australia. With a few weeks until the federal election, we all need to do whatever we can to make more noise and to capitalise on the current media attention and peaking that's happening. We obviously need to do so safely, as unfortunately the risks are very real. Adult human females have rights based on our sex, and they are under attack. Most of the population do not subscribe to this ideology and certainly don't want it in our sports, because bodies play sport, not identities. For the sake of women's sport, it must be preserved for female bodies, for women only.
Sand Hall, can I invite you to speak?
I'm on Dharawal land, always was, always will be. And tonight is a particularly good one for this sort of women's business. It's a new moon, or rather dark moon in Taurus, with a partial sun eclipse. So an influence supporting feminist values, art, beauty, appreciation of nature, and feminine qualities. So may our feminist revolutionary juices flow tonight, and our revolutionary values. The trans agenda has plagued me for the last 30 years. Prior to 1994, I organised lesbian festivals, gatherings, concerts, community and cultural events. The idea was to have fun and nourish ourselves. Lesbian and feminist activism is challenging work, We need the fun times. Lesbian feminists live knowing the personal is political, and we understand the need to combine business with pleasure. I love the energy of gatherings of women. They nourish my soul. The trans movement is a men's rights movement that has given men who simply self-declared themselves as women the right to access all women's spaces and speak for all women. I'm sure patriarchy could not be more delighted with its success. They happily funded and changed laws to enable it. All too suddenly, it became illegal for me to organise events for women without allowing men who say they are women to attend. In 2006, Sappho's Party, a lesbian gathering in South Australia, was taken to the South Australian Anti-Discrimination Board by a man claiming to be a lesbian who felt excluded. The law was on his side. We have gone underground. The impact on lesbians has been the loss of freedom of association. Lesbian spaces have been lost, and an underground movement largely inaccessible to new and emerging lesbians was formed. New and emerging lesbians lost access to culture and elders. Our human rights, freedom of speech, and so much more has been decimated. Everyone's fear of saying the emperor has no clothes on, and the nonsense notion that an XY chromosome person can become an XX chromosome person have removed feminist role models from several generations of gender non-conforming women. Trans and queer misogyny and brainwashing is leading to young butch lesbians thinking they have little choice but to cut off their breasts and take testosterone for the rest of their lives in order to be safe and fit in. My blood boiled recently when I read Max Robinson's excellent book, Detransition, Beyond, Before and After, published by Spinifex Press. It's scary to see the huge growth in women transitioning. Max had cut off her breasts and took testosterone before finding out that lesbian feminist community existed, at which point her life made sense and she detransitioned. 31 years ago, I was part of organising a sold-out lesbian Sydney Opera House concert. Thousands of lesbians attended a 10-day national festival and conference. There was an atmosphere of euphoria and such diversity. Personally, I tend to identify as femme with a butch moon and androgyny rising. We all bent gender to suit ourselves. After the concert, we formed the Lesbian Space Project and went on to raise big money and bought a lesbian building in Newtown, Sydney. It was to be used as a lesbian cultural and community centre. During this time, the trans invasion began. And in the process of achieving anti-discrimination legislation, walked roughshod over the Sydney lesbian community. This invasion divided our community and led to the sale of that building and an enormous loss of identity, community, and visibility. For me, the key issue was about whether men who say they are women could be members of the Lesbian Space Project and therefore have power and control. The issue was not about access to the centre so much as it was about membership. Since then, the anti-feminist, queer and trans movements have continued to remove women's and lesbians' human rights in favour of trans rights. They've hoodwinked nearly everyone everywhere through threats and the silencing of good women. This has led to the loss of our national festivals and conferences. We cannot publicly advertise gatherings for women born female. Lesbian is intrinsically female. They have tried to rebrand us with a new flag, new symbols and derogatory names such as TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminists. They have given false meaning to the word lesbian. I have no problem with gender bending. My issue is with space invasion and the incredibly shallow thinking that conflates sex and gender. Sex is biological and innate. Gender is a social construct and can be very fluid. Last weekend, I attended a women's spirituality weekend, not lesbian, women. Numbers were low and it ran at a loss because women were afraid to be called transphobic simply by attending a women's event. If we follow the money and power, as Susan Hawthorne did in her excellent book, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, again, Spinifex Press, it leads to the billionaires and the political power they wield. It leads to pharmaceutical companies and the medical establishment generally. Trans people are dependent on drugs and medical support for life. It goes to the core of patriarchy, their determination to control women and their fear of women's independence, particularly lesbians and radical feminists, women who relentlessly call out male violence and abuse and who control our own bodies and lives. We keep saying the emperor has no clothes on. We keep challenging this fetish of autogynephilia, men who get off sexually on being perceived as women, dressing as women, being accepted as women. It's a very real part of what is happening. These are truly weird and crazy times, and when it comes to the human rights of women and children in particular, the parallels are there with the war in Ukraine, cultural genocide. I find the word culture a difficult one to use these days. Cults have structures and rules with punishment if broken. It's everywhere. We continue to stay our course of women's liberation. We hold the line on who women are and the intrinsically female nature of lesbians. The madness and lies are gradually being exposed with education, research, science, and the bravery of women. There are brave women, such as those here tonight, who will not be silenced. And gradually, the tide of ignorance is turning. It's heartening for me to see the resurgence of the lesbian organisation COAL, of whom I see that there are several committee members and members here tonight. The Coalition of Activist Lesbians Australia is a lesbian human rights organisation that gained United Nations accreditation in 1993 in order to participate in the 1995 Fourth United Nations World Conference on Women in Beijing. I was one of the lesbians who, thanks to federal funding, and yes, it was when there was a Keating government and Carmen Lawrence was Minister for Health, we got funding to attend, COAL got funding to attend that UN conference. We represented Australian lesbians at the NGO forum and the conference itself. And while there, I also represented lesbians of the Asia Pacific region on the coordinating group of the lesbian tent at the NGO forum. That tent was the first time there was lesbian space in China and in United Nations territory. It was also the last time. There has not been a women's conference since then. And after the conference, some delegates, generally males, returned home to African countries, mainly and Sri Lanka, and had legislation put in place to criminalise lesbianism. It is also heartening to see at the recent United Nations CSW 66 conference in New York that CEDAW, the Committee to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, are voicing support for a Sri Lankan lesbian who is spearheading the removal of the criminal status of lesbians, not only in Sri Lanka, but via CEDAW and the UN, in all 43 countries that currently criminalise lesbian sexual activity. For myself, in more recent times, I've been publishing books of our stories, books that go to libraries and universities. I've just started putting the call out for contributions to a third collection of stories and photos from women involved over the past 50 years with the women's lands in New South Wales. For 45 years, I've been part of the women's lands in northern New South Wales. Now, as a photographer, I have thousands of photos of all sorts of women's and lesbian events I've been part of over the decades, including the women's lands. It has been satisfying to publish some of them and not just think they need to be archived. The two previous books have provided researchers, the media, searching women and historians with a point of reference for stories of gender non-conforming women. Women who use chainsaws, sleep under stars and around fires, drive four-wheel drives and build shelters, make music and theatre, have feasts and adventures. Women who have no need of surgery or hormones to experience freedom and independence. Of course, the utopian vision is fraught with dysfunction and conflict, but Landis' life and sisterhood is powerful. And I also like Bronwyn Winter's term feminist solidarity, which can be used instead of sisterhood. There's a conversation to be had about the nuances of sisterhood and feminist solidarity. I like Robin Morgan's definition of ethical governance as the virtuosity with which we practice gossip. There is much to be gained from the benefit of hindsight and vision and the analysing of power and relationships. Self-publishing books is a tangible way to share and educate. It's led to the making of programs on Radio National's History Lesson series, also a forum as part of the IWD All About Women series at the Opera House, oral history recordings and various inquiries from filmmakers, researchers and historians. Last night, I Zoomed with a couple of women interested in turning some of the stories into a TV series, drama series for SBS. Now, I don't know about that one, but the interest is out there. And if there are visible leads to follow, connections can happen. In finishing, although the United Nations is a bit of a toothless tiger, I have always believed that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is the best vehicle to be working with for women's, children, and lesbian human rights. Part of my daily practice in life is to tune in to the spirit of humanity and ride the fun that can be had on those waves.
I would really love us to hear now from Karyn Lisignoli. Karyn.
I'm here to talk just very, very briefly about a campaign that's been launched that I'm a spokesperson for, and just to give a very brief overview of why I'm one of the spokespersons for that organisation, for that campaign. So the campaign is Respect My Sex If You Want My Vote Australia. So the website is respectmysexaustralia.org. And basically it's a campaign that's replicated on the Respect My Sex If You Want My Ex campaign that was launched by some very high profile women and female activists in the UK. And of course over there it's Respect My Sex If You Want My Ex, because they put an X in the ballot paper, where of course we use, over here we use numbers, and hence the is Respect My Sex If You Want My Vote. So the whole campaign is, again, as the two previous speakers have alluded to, is about raising awareness of how the radical trans agenda has usurped and undermined long and hard fought for women's rights in most states and, of course, across Australia. So whether that's come from the basic, as we've heard now, the basic definition of women, which has been suddenly used no longer someone who is a biological female, an adult biological female, or an underage biological female, if we're talking about the definition of a girl, to someone who self-IDs as such, which unfortunately, as we have just realised, means that all of those hard fought for rights in order to develop female-only spaces, which of course is based on our biology. If we look at the long history and the long history of oppression and injustice that women have experienced in various forms across the world, and unfortunately for a lot of women in the developing world, still actually experience quite severe oppression and injustices as a result of the societies and the cultures that they live in. Fortunately, in the West, we've been campaigning, and of course, we've heard from people here as just some small examples of the areas in which we've been campaigning since, of course, decades and decades and decades. to ensure female-based rights, because it is our biology. It is the fact that women are physiologically and physically weaker than men. It is the fact that women menstruate and have child-rearing and pregnancy and other issues like that, which have put us in a far more physically vulnerable position to men, which has historically been one of the mechanisms that then has ensured that women have been locked out of a whole variety of other spaces, such as the political sphere, such as economic spheres, etc. So these very hard fought for rights, in which many of which have been established in the Western world, has now been usurped under this change within either the federal or state, either equality acts or discrimination acts, in order to allow self-ID rather than biological female as the definition of what a woman is. So the problem with this, as we've just said, under the banner of self-ID, we can get anyone who's genuinely suffering from body dysphoria, and of that population of people, only about 10% will actually have full gender reassignment surgery, aka have genital surgery. So of that percentage of the population who are genuine people with body dysphoria, who classify themselves as adults and who wish to live as a female, so trans-identified males, only 10% actually have physical surgery, full gender reassignment surgery, aka these are, as have been described by the rest of the panel, for all intentional purposes, very much biological males. Under this self-ID, we have that a population of people that can obviously then access women's spaces. We also have, as been described before, a whole pile of men, and again, there is various debates about what percentage of the population who identify as trans is this particular population. And that is men that suffer from a paraphilia, from a sexual kink, which is called autogynephilia. These are men who get sexually aroused at the thought of being seen as female. And therefore, these are the men who are then often aggressively wanting to encounter on lesbian spaces and things like that. And there's a very strong argument to suggest that this is the cohort of men who are very aggressively behind the entire radical trans agenda, because this is a movement of men driven by a sexual drive to occupy female spaces, because they, of course, get sexually aroused by doing so and by therefore being seen as a female. And there's no more better definition or better recognition of being female by then being able to access female-only spaces, which, as we've talked about here on the panel, is things like sports, it's particular sports, it's schools, it's change rooms, it's refuges, it's jails, and it's a whole pile of obviously other venues and spaces where women, as we say, have fought for and have the right to secure those spaces based on their biology. And the other person or the other group of people under the trans and gender, when we allow self-ID, so we can have people with genuine body dysphoria, we can have people with autogynephilia, and we can also then have just any male predator who wants to access female. Our jails are filled, our criminal journals, our stories. We have many, many stories of the lengths that predatory males will go to in order to secure victims. So it is absolutely absurd to think that they wouldn't do something which is as basic as self-ID, that they do not have to take hormones, do not have to have surgery, do not have to do any of those things. And we know, unfortunately, as a result of the huge amount of young people who have gone through a transition process and are now detransitioning, who have talked about how easy it is to get that instantaneous recognition as being trans. So again, under the whole radical trans agenda, there is the entire other issue of what is happening to overwhelmingly vulnerable young girls with rapid onset gender dysphoria, a population of people. So again, if we just look at general body or / gender dysphoria, this is a population of people. And again, I'm sorry if I'm telling everybody how to suck eggs. I feel very much I'm probably doing so, given the wealth of knowledge of people on the panel and no doubt in the room. But people who've got body genuine dysphoria, if we have no intervention at all, if we just have a wait and see policy, research will show that 70 to 90% of those will end up just coming to being comfortable with their body and their gender, and a huge percentage of those will actually just be young gay people. And of course, a big percentage of, okay, so that's just the general issue. If those young people have some type of exploratory therapy as well, then often the numbers will edge up further towards 90%. So of a condition that used to overwhelmingly be male, that used to be held visible and available in a very small percentage of the population and would be there very long term, only about 10 to 20% would maintain that position into adulthood. This has now been hijacked into an affirmation model such that any young child who experiences that, so instead of the expectation that they would be between the 70 to 80 to 90%, that would just be, hey, cool, I'm fine with that. And then a percentage of which, again, a big percentage which would just be gay. We are instead affirming them as trans and pushing them on a affirmation model of which we are pushing them younger and younger, which by definition, we know that young people don't have the maturity, don't have their brains hardwired enough, don't have the neuroscience, don't have the physical capacity, emotional capacity in order to make these decisions, are being put on pre-puberty blockers, and then from that, an overwhelming percentage are going onto opposite sex hormones and then into transition, etc. And now we're getting the pipeline of enormous amounts of kids getting to that other end and detransitioning. It's overwhelmingly girls. It's exploded. It's come on very rapidly. It has all the absolute characteristics, and I'll stop talking about it because, again, it's just getting terribly boring, of a social contagion, which we all know that young girls developmentally are far more susceptible to that, particularly when we also discover that a big percentage of these young girls and these young kids, but again, overwhelmingly girls, have got autism, have got such things as anorexia or bulimia, have got severe depression and anxiety, have often come back from very traumatic dealing with other trauma and other experiences as well too. So AKA a group of kids that has obviously got some very complex issues, and it's highly likely that the gender dysphoria or the body dysphoria is the actual presentation of what is underneath a whole pile of really quite co-combining and more issues that what are called comorbidities, but basically means that obviously they kind of have a negative multiplication factor into each other. So again, I've segued down there, so excuse me for rambling a little bit, but Respect My Sex Australia is a campaign that is non-partisan, that's been very quickly pulled together and been taken off the campaign from the wonderful women over in the UK, which is designed to raise awareness. We just want lots of media attention. We want lots of people to know about this. We want people writing stories, etc., about it as well too. But the fundamental aim of the campaign is to raise awareness out in the community about what is actually happening under the transgender, because people don't know. People are busy. People don't know what's been happening in the refuges, in the jails, in a lot of the schools, in things like Girl Guides, and that's where I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. Girl Guides, the longest standing girls only Girls Development Organisation has also capitulated to this ideology with no consultation with the community, etc. So the idea of the Respect Myself, My Sex, If You Want My Vote campaign is to raise awareness under the community that all of these things are happening, all these rights, these rules have now been changed, and people first of all need to know about it. Thank heavens. I think it's horrific for the poor young girls that were competing against her, but thank heavens for Leah Thomas, because now the rest of the world are kind of going, you've got to be kidding me. You know, like again, as Sal Grover says, when we're being told to ignore the evidence of our eyes, when we've got what is very obviously a huge, massive female in a sport like swimming, you know what I mean? Like everyone's just kind of going, yeah, a huge, massive female, excuse me, a huge, massive male in a sport competing against smaller females. It's actually made it very obvious to a lot of people, because while people are busy, we all in many ways relate to sport. So the whole idea is to say, it's not just sport. It's not just elite sport. It's at community sport. It's in all these other areas. It's in girls' change rooms. It's in Girl Guides. It's in schools. It's in here, etc. raise the awareness, then encourage people out there to actually raise these issues with their politicians. And you may have heard or may have seen certain aspects where people are doing things like, what is a woman, and asking politicians that. So it's that type of thing. And on the website, there's a series of different questions to ask, much more specifically about, are you comfortable with girls being with biological males in their change room, competing in sports with them, etc. And the third thing is, for the politicians, we want this to be big enough so that the politicians realise just how absurd this is and actually work to change the laws back. So in places like WA, where I am, they haven't changed the laws to recognise self-ID, not under the Equality Act. We have under a whole pile of other acts, but not actually fundamentally under the Equality Act. But in a lot of other places and in Australia, those changes have already been made to recognise self-ID. So that's the aim of the campaign. The reason why I'm a spokesperson is that I'm in it, or for it, is because I've got a long experience of being a CEO in the charitable sector. I've seen a whole variety of what I see of very, very bad ideology and philosophy come through under critical social justice. And I think that's come all to a terribly big head with the trans agenda. I was working as a leadership mentor for a while, went back into the workforce to work for Girl Guides WA as a change agent. And I'm sorry, I haven't checked my time, so I don't know whether I'm thinking I'm probably getting close to 10, 15 minutes now, so I'll stop. I won't speak too much, but basically I was brought on as a change agent. I've been there for 10 days. I've made a number of changes. I literally reached out to Catherine, ironically, Catherine Deeves on Twitter to develop a partnership with her and a connection with her. That got taken up by a small newspaper here out in Perth, which asked a series of questions, and within a matter of hours I was marched out the door with my little cardboard box and my lunch for the next week in it. So yes, and then I took that story public after Girl Guides refused to speak to me, and I said to them, there's a far bigger issue than this. There's a far bigger public relations issue. There's a huge issue here for girls and young women. There's a huge issue when the rest of the world, because the trans issue has just got so absurd that people don't know what's going on. People are starting to realise what's going on. When there's going to be a big backlash, and all those institutions that capitulated to it, aka such as Girl Guides WA, will then be basically in a hole. There will be quite a severe public backlash, but they weren't interested at all. So hence I took the story public, and as a result of that, and now as a part of this campaign. So I think that's